So before I ordained, one of my greatest passions was studying and reading literature. And the books that made the deepest impact on my life belong to a genre called the literature of witness, which are stories, plays, and poems about the atrocities of the 20th century. And looking back, I'm very grateful to my literature teachers for putting together a really good curriculum. I remember in 5th grade, we learned about the Holocaust when we read this book called Friedrich. The narrator is a non-Jewish boy, and it's about how he experiences, he's just looking at what happens to his Jewish friend as Hitler comes to power in Germany. And I think that was the first book I read where the protagonist died, and it was, just devastating, like, oh, good guys die. For apparently no clear reason. And after that, I remember we read a book about Chernobyl. I can't remember the title, but it was about a family surviving a nuclear disaster. And in high school, we read To Kill a Mockingbird, which was about racism in the South. And also, we spent a lot of time reading war poetry from the First and Second World War. And eventually at college, I read a lot of post-colonial literature, African-American literature, which was about living in the shadow of colonialism and slavery. And I was very moved when one of my professors wrote a play about the genocide in Rwanda. And he still brings students there till today to bear witness to what happened 22 years ago. So this idea of bearing witness is one that I valued very much in my life, that as people of conscience, we cannot turn away when other sentient beings, especially whole groups of sentient beings, experience suffering, and that we have to find some strength in us, in our society, to acknowledge what's happening, even if it's incredibly shocking, unthinkable, right? And that in itself is a form of action. I do believe that just witnessing, listening, empathizing are important social actions. There's a story that after the genocide in Rwanda, all the dogs were out on the street eating the cadavers, but there was just one dog that didn't eat the bodies, even though it was starving. So the story goes that he was watching over the bodies of his owners. And just the actions of this dog moved everyone very deeply. Right? That it wasn't business as usual for this dog, like, oh look, more food, right? Let's eat the dead and move on. So I think it's very important to stand alongside the dead, right? To grieve, to heal, to find hope. So I was thinking about all this because we're revisiting some of the principles of nonviolent communication here at the Abbey. And I remember when I first learned about self-empathy, there are certain steps you have to take. The first step is to engage your compassionate witness. And when I heard this from our facilitator, Lachelle, I was like, what's that? A compassionate witness? So the funniest thing is, I value doing this on a social level. It's so important to bear witness to sufferings of the world. But I just couldn't imagine having an inner compassionate witness. Like, even after having met the Dharma, up till that point, most of my self-talk was very critical, judgmental. And in retreat, the first time I sat retreat, it was unbelievable to just hear that voice railing on myself, like, you're not good enough, you did it wrong again. Like, whoa, where is this coming from? And to hear someone say, you have the strength to bear witness to that. You have to call up some kind of compassionate witness in yourself that says, it's okay. This is an okay reaction. So it says in Lachelle's handout, she's describing what it means to engage your compassionate witness. She says, turn towards your experience rather than away. So she gives some examples of self-talk you can have here. You can say, I'm reacting. It's okay to react. I can pause and notice what's happening inside. What's most important is a compassionate relationship to my experience. I don't have to have any particular experience. And I was just shocked by how difficult this was. I think my tendency has always been to suppress difficult emotions. From my side, I know it's a lot to do with perfectionism or arrogance or attachment to reputation. I'm not supposed to feel this way. Other people suffer more. If I feel this way, I'm selfish. I'm not supposed to express my feelings and needs. Good Buddhists don't get angry. All that sort of nonsense thinking. But when it comes up, it feels very real, and my habit is to just stuff it, but it doesn't go away. Right, so a big part of my practice, I think, in the last 1 or 2 years is just trying to understand what this compassionate witness could feel like in my own mind. I shared some of the struggle with Venerable Children, who is my living role model of compassion. Right? But ultimately, I had to figure out how to do this for myself. She could model some things about listening with empathy, but I just had to find it in myself. And eventually what I did come to was Chenrezig, the Buddha of compassion, the hearer of the cries of the world. And I will say Chenrezig is my compassionate witness. And what I did after that, just bringing Chenrezig into my mind, a lot of my practice was about bringing Chenrezig to times in my life where I felt, very sad or hurt or had unresolved feelings, and just bringing Chenrezig there to witness, to grieve, to heal, instead of discounting or dismissing or suppressing those moments. So after engaging your compassionate witness, the next step in self-empathy is to resource or anchor in the expansive perspective. So what this means here is to bring to mind something that reduces your reactivity in the moment and helps you to access your compassion, skill, and wisdom. So here, Lachelle gives some suggestions. She says, ask yourself, what could I remember right now that would help me connect to my inner resources or locate in a bigger perspective? She says, here are some possibilities. Recognize the truth of the moment. I know that even though I feel scared, I am not in danger. Right? Sometimes when we're confronted with a trigger, it's like, but just to ground and say, no one's actually harming me right now. Or she says, bring to awareness resources in your life. I remember the people who love and support me. Or use your body to shift, stretch, stand, or sit tall and take a slow, deep breath. And the last piece, she suggests, call upon a spiritual practice, recite a grounding mantra or prayer. So I will say that, again, Chenrezig practice helps me with that. When I'm in my panic zone or terrified or reacting, sometimes I just visualize Chenrezig and recite mantra. I like to do His Holiness the Dalai Lama's name mantra. It's quite long. It helps me to cut through my rumination a lot, just to shift the mind to focus on that. So it's totally non-intellectual, just shifting out of that ruminating space. And what I found is that it's only after I've done these two steps, right, bearing witness to my own mental suffering, and then finding a way to anchor the mind in wisdom and compassion, then I can revisit what the trigger was. And so in nonviolent communication, the process is to identify the bare observation, see what our interpretation was, and then look at our feelings, needs, and requests around what happened, many steps. But, I just wanted to draw attention to those first two steps. If I haven't done them, when I go back, I'll just get triggered all over again. I'll just sit there and ruminate, right, until I've actually gotten in touch with, wow, I'm really angry, and that's okay. And let me have some compassion for myself in that moment. So thinking about just how difficult it's been to do those first two steps for self-empathy, it made me reflect on how challenging it is to heal at the community and social levels. It takes a lot of courage on the part of everyone involved, and it takes a lot of time. I suppose sometimes it seems easier to eat the dead and move on. But the curious thing is that once I was able to even bear witness to my own mental suffering with some compassion and space, it was easier for me to empathize with people that I used to really revile. People who sell their children, or labor and sex traffickers, abusive employers, they pop up and immediately I'm like, ugh. And it helped me to see, wow, when I look at my afflictions with some honesty, then I see that we're not very different at all, these people, and those evil people versus good me, right? It's like, no, we have the same afflictions. And I can see very clearly that when we're overwhelmed by ignorance, attachment, and anger, especially attachment to the 8 worldly concerns, then all of us are capable of harming others. So that's why transforming our minds is so important. I do sincerely think it is the most important thing we can do with our lives. So in closing, I'd just like to share a famous poem from this genre of literature of witness. It's by a poet named Caroline Forche. She was a poet, is still a poet, who was a human rights activist in El Salvador during the civil war between the government, and there were left-wing guerrilla groups there, and the war lasted 12 years. And the UN estimates that over 75,000 people were killed by the government, and that was supported by the Carter and Reagan administration during the Cold War. So, for me anyway, it's a poem about listening with compassion. So the title is The Colonel by Caroline Forche. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows, there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I am tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground.